And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you, along with Cheryl Jones. Cheryl, welcome back. How are you?
Well, I'm fine, George. How are you?
It's good. We missed you in Columbus, Ohio. I know you tried to get out there, but you missed a great show.
I heard it was fantastic, and yes, I'm sorry I wasn't able to make it, but my spirit was there.
Yes, it was. And we've got many shows planned for next year that Tom's working on, and he'll get you some locations, and maybe you can pop up at one of them.
Well, that'll be great. I just don't know what I would come dressed as.
Well, no, that was only for Halloween.
Okay, all right.
Don't put on a costume if it's in March or April or something like that.
Oh, gee, okay, I'll come as myself.
That's right. So when you were at CNN in your day, as a news anchor and a meteorologist, but let me ask you the news anchor question. How would you have handled the story that broke yesterday with this crazy person who shot up people in a bowling alley and a bar? Do you have crews all over the country with CNN?
Yes, at that time, sure would have. You know, that's a delicate situation to handle, because you have to be aware of the copycat syndrome, and that, of course, is really evidence in the lack of reporting on, say, suicides. But in stories like this, my concern in terms of what's happening now is that there's such a reluctance to release the identification and motives and that sort of thing early on, but they have to be very careful. We understand that, and the officials, that is. But sometimes I think sometimes things are reported in a way that raises more questions or suspicions, and that's not good.
No, it's not good at all. They were at his house today. They've got his car, but they can't find him yet. So he's either hiding or maybe he killed himself. You never know.
Well, and it seems like they're also very, very, very quick to report when someone is or has a military background, and I'm not sure that's really needed to be emphasized as much as they do.
You know, they put him in a mental facility for 2 weeks where he claimed he was hearing voices and wanted to shoot up a military base and all that, so it's not good.
No, not good. And, of course, the voices is a whole other thing that a lot of people have opinions on.
Prayers for those injured and for those killed and for their families, of course.
Exactly.
So tell us about the Weird Historian.
Well, tonight, George, we take a walk on the really bizarre side of UFO and alien history with historian, writer, and author Mark Harsman, also known as the Weird Historian. He's certainly a connoisseur of the bizarre. Some know him as the creative advertising guy who was a big winner on the Wheel of Fortune a few years back, who writes about the true oddities in life. And he's written books on unorthodox messages from God, sideshow performers, and weird things on eBay. And for his new book, just released, Mark went digging through a treasure trove of history books and records about UFOs and aliens and picked out some of the most unusual, strange but true things he could find, including hybrids and the odd pop culture around it all from his unique vantage point. His latest book is titled We're Not Alone, The Extraordinary History of UFOs and Aliens, Invading Our Hopes, Fears, and Fantasies. Listen now to my conversation with the Weird Historian, Mark Hartzman.
Hello, Mark. Welcome back to Coast.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here again.
You're called the Weird Historian and also one of America's leading connoisseurs of the bizarre. How did you earn that noble description?
I started a website in 2016 called Weird Historian because I do love just writing about weird history, and I've written a lot of books with that general theme. So the site gave me a place to just write all kinds of different stories based on a pretty wide variety of weird historical moments. One of America's leading connoisseurs of the bizarre was a title given to me by Buck Wolf from ABC News. Years back, he had written a few reviews of some of my early books. One of them was about really weird things I found on eBay and all kinds of weird, bizarre things. And then also a book called American Sideshow that covered a history of sideshow performers from the mid-1800s to the early 2000s. So he gave me that title, and I believe I've lived up to quite nicely, I hope, with all my other books since then.
You've written about everything weird and bizarre: ghosts, Mars, Oliver Cromwell's embalmed head, unorthodox messages from God, and much, much more. But now your latest book, We're Not Alone, The Extraordinary History of Aliens Invading Our Hopes, Fears, and Fantasies. What was your inspiration for this book and title?
I love the title, We Are Not Alone. I just feel like it's very declarative and provocative. What is out there, we don't know exactly, but there's certainly a lot of evidence that points to something being out there. And then the subtitle is the extraordinary history of UFOs and aliens invading our hopes, fears, and fantasies. I think to some degree we all hope that we're not alone. There's something comforting about knowing that we're not the only thing in the entire universe. It's also a little bit scary. What are these things? Are they going to be friendly? Are they harmful? Have they done anything to us already? And then our fantasies. I mean, we kind of imagine what things might be. And in terms of my inspiration, I've been fascinated by this topic since I was a kid. And then when I did the Mars book, it's called The Big Book of Mars. That book got into a little bit of UFO history in the 40s and early 50s. And so I kind of started touching on it there, a little bit of Roswell, a few things before and after. And of course, it's so relevant now. I mean, there's been so much conversation over the past few years and the congressional interest. So it's been a great time to be writing about this topic.
What makes this book, Mark, different from all other books out there that have been out there over the decades on the history of UFOs and aliens? And how did you pick the most weird or bizarre stories?
So, of course, I cover off on some of the more known historical UFO cases, sightings, experiences. But I go from early to mid 40s, even before Kenneth Arnold and Roswell, and I go up to what's going on now, and I get into the behind the scenes of how these congressional hearings took place, how the 2017 New York Times article that really kind of broke this story open about the research into unidentified aerial phenomena began, and I get into a lot of the science as well in the book. So what scientists are doing, what their efforts are within SETI, within Avi Loeb's Galileo project, different beliefs in extraterrestrial life that date back to the turn of the century Victorian era, and then just a range of different kinds of experiences from sightings to experiences to abductions, and the contactees as well from the 50s, the people who thought they met Venusians. So I don't know that there's another book that covers as much about the topic, that widespread. In terms of picking the most bizarre stories, that was not easy because there's so many, and because of the breadth of the book I just described, of course, can only have so many pages I can fill, so it is a little tough to try to find that balance of bizarre stories that are sort of known and finding some different angles to them or some new information, and then some lesser known ones.
What's the most curious ancient alien story that you came across?
So there's a lot of pretty curious ancient alien stories. There was one I found that I thought was really quite unique. This was the Great Airship Flap of 1896 and 1897. This was a series of sightings that started really off the coast of California. And so just, for a little context, this was, several years before the Wright brothers took off at Kitty Hawk. Some airships may have been coming off the ground, but not piloted. So it was a very odd thing that people were seeing. But then there's all these reports you find in these newspaper archives of it continuing across the country. From state to state, people are seeing these things. Unusual airships are drifting through the sky. They're being described as egg-shaped or having, a bird-like body. They've got these brilliant searchlights that are being described in fan-like wheels. And they're going about 20 miles an hour, according to different reports. So again, this is like a series of stories going over the course of about 5 or 6 months. And there was one in 1897 in Aurora, Texas. And this one involved one of the airships that crashed. And people said that they found the body and that the body had come from Mars. And so this Martian body was supposedly recovered and it was buried in a local cemetery. So I love this story for a few reasons, because 1897 would be around the time when there was a lot of belief in intelligent life on Mars. This is also right around the time that H.G. Wells is writing War of the Worlds in a serial form, being published chapter by chapter before it came out as the full book novel. And then I also love it's 1897, and the town becomes this tourist destination to find this crashed alien body. And that's exactly 50 years before Roswell.
Your first chapter opens with a really friendly greeting to Earthling readers with a visit to David Marler's historical UFO archive museum, shall we say, in New Mexico. And then it takes us on to Roswell. And you also end up with a wild story about a top-shaped UFO. Tell us about that.
So David Marler has this amazing archive. He's just outside of Albuquerque. He's got all the Project Blue Book materials, all their files. He's got all kinds of ephemera, newspaper clippings, headlines, recordings, every media possible. So this was incredible. He's actually now expanding it. Now it's called the National UFO Historical Records Center versus just, David Marler's archive. So he's got an official thing going with this because it keeps growing. And then from there, I want to take a road trip to Roswell because how can you not? And because I mentioned I was going there, he told me he knew a guy there who had a UFO experience in 1964 when he was 8 years old. And he was just playing, just regular day outside. And he sees this object a few stories up in the air across the street. And he said it was top shaped. And it's just kind of hovering there. And he's kind of moving left and moving right. And the thing is mimicking his motions, moving left, moving right. All of a sudden, it zips right over his head. And it just belches out this flame right over his head. And his grandmother had stepped outside and saw it. And, he rushed over to her. The thing took off. And he was burned. Like the neck up, he's just completely burned. Rushed him to the hospital. And fortunately, there was a burn specialist at the hospital who helped him. But this was a case that was documented in newspapers. He had the FBI investigating this story. This wasn't just like, he's making something up, right? This thing happened. FBI came investigated. They couldn't find any evidence of what would have caused this. There was nothing. They looked at all the different possibilities. Were there matches on the ground? Was there any evidence left behind that might explain it? And there wasn't. That was very odd. And when I talked to him, he hadn't talked about this case really since talking to the press in 1964. And really since then, he'd spoken to no one until David Marler found him a few years back. And then I met him in Roswell for lunch. But what was so amazing too, and this is completely credit David Marler in the book, but as he researched that case, he found that there were other cases within the months before and after where top-shaped UFOs were being spotted, and they always seemed to be on Tuesdays. This was just so weird. And again, no explanations for this on any of the cases. These were just cases that were happening with no explanation on Tuesday nights. But this happened, and of course, the book just gets into so much more after that.
We can't talk about the extraordinary history of UFOs and aliens without mentioning our dear recently departed mutual friend, the legendary UFO researcher Lee Spiegel, who really left a huge mark in UFO history and whom you highlight in the book.
Lee was hugely helpful in me being able to do this book. And so I owe him so much. And I'm so sad he's gone. It took me by surprise. Lee opened a lot of doors for me. I've known him for years. We both worked for AOL Weird News together. He was the UFO guy. I was the sideshow guy. And he was terrific. He just was such a passionate, brilliant journalist who'd been studying this topic since the 70s. And, Lee knew everybody. And I do talk about Lee's particular story. Lee, of course, he had a fascination with the topic, but he had gotten to know J. Allen Hynek, who was the main scientist behind Project Blue Book. And after Project Blue Book started the Center for UFO Studies, called CUFOS. And so Lee was working with him. And there was a case in Lumberton, North Carolina in the mid-70s. And J. Allen Hynek said he couldn't go to investigate it. So he sent Lee down. And it was a triangular UFO. He took a flight down to North Carolina right away, met with the police chief. They went out searching for it. And at first he told me, they didn't see anything, and they'd go from place to place and they weren't seeing anything. And finally they did see it, and they pulled off the side of the road, and it was him and the police chief and I think a few other, officers and other witnesses as well. And they saw this triangular shaped craft about treetop level, completely silent. It blinked at them, shot a light down at his feet. And then took off quietly. He said that they chased it for a while, but eventually, kind of lost it. But there was never any explanation to this case. He wrote up his report. He investigated, spoke with people at the local Air Force Base and checked on flight patterns, all these different kinds of things that maybe it's this, maybe it's that, but nothing synced up with what they experienced and what they saw.
You write about another legendary case in UFO history where the witness recently passed away as well, and that was Calvin Parker from the Pascagoula incident of 1973. And you frame it with saying the two fishermen who got caught. What about that story piqued your interest?
Well, this was one of the early abduction stories. This followed, you had Betty and Barney Hill in 1961. And this was, these two guys just fishing in Pascagoula. And this craft comes down, this strange creature comes out, takes them aboard, does some weird experiments and puts them back. And these guys, report it right away. They were terrified. I spoke with Ray Stanford, who's a UFO investigator. And he told me that when he met with Charlie Hickson, who was older than Calvin Parker, they were separated, had a bit of an age gap between the two. He said that Charlie Hickson was incredibly credible. He said he'd never heard someone that felt more genuine or authentic than anyone he'd spoken to on the topic. So he felt very confident about Charlie Hickson's description of what he went through. They seemed very positive that something happened. Was it a new UFO abduction? It could have been. And of course, I give some reasons in the book why they believe that. And There's another theory I talked about, which I thought was interesting. This was from a writer, Nick Redfern, who proposed that maybe this was related to something that was going on nearby, which was on Horn Island, which was just off the coast, where in the 50s and 60s, CIA secret projects like MK Ultra were experimenting with different drugs, LSD and so forth, and other kinds of hallucinogenics or whatever it could be to try to develop mind control or mess with the brain, control the brain some way. And that was supposedly stopped, but these secret projects kind of went on, at least till the 70s. So maybe some of this was going on and kind of wafting through. They stopped it because they said that the fumes were kind of wafting over and could reach people. I just thought that was an interesting theory. But again, just kind of adds to the lore of all of it, of what exactly happened to these two guys.
Fascinating guy, Cheryl.
Yes, he is, and there's so many more fascinating stories in his book, but the great thing about his book is that he has a lot of supporting graphics and clippings, and I guess it was really, really a fascinating time to spend so much time with David Marler in his UFO archives.
His book, We Are Not Alone, is the same title that the original Walter Sullivan from the New York Times wrote.
Well, I guess that's good. That's why he has the subtitle of The Extraordinary History of UFOs and Aliens Invading Our Hopes, Fears, and Fantasies. So Martin does take a different twist. He looks at things through a unique lens. It's kind of like a Twilight Zone view of things, and looks for the weird and the bizarre and very unusual. And when we come back, we're going to hear more about some really strange stories about aliens, UFOs, hybrids, and believe it or not, also about fairies. And there's really no other way to verify some of these stories, like the one with the 8-year-old guy from Roswell that he met. But there is a newspaper clipping in his book, and he says that it's up to you what you want to believe.
How long has he been at this?
As far as writing books, he's been at it a long, long time, several years. And he's been a guest on the coast, but it's been years ago that he has been on the show. But he just decided he wanted to write about the strange stories that he kept coming across in the world of ufology, UAPs, and aliens, of course.
Cheryl, tell people how they can email you.
Okay, that's my name, CherylJones.com. That's the website, but on the website you'll also see my email, spacenews@yahoo.com.
And she spells her name with 2 L's, and we've got that link at coasttocoastam.com. And when we come back in a moment, she'll have part 2 with the weird historian, Mark Hartzman, and we'll talk about some of the strange things that she just mentioned. In our final hour of the show tonight, we open up the phone lines, giving you an opportunity to chat with Cheryl. Open lines with Cheryl Jones on Coast to Coast AM. So we'll be back in a moment for part 2. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you, along with Cheryl Jones. Cheryl, Mark has been on 4 times, all the way back to 2006. So pretty prolific guest for us.
Yes, he's absolutely wonderful. And if you go to his website, weirdhistorian.com, you'll see a list of all of the strange books he has written, and they're all very strange. Possibly no one's stranger than the other, but you'll find something there that piques your interest.
He loves these weird things, doesn't he?
And he's excellent at it. He has a way, he has a knack about looking at something and seeing the odd and the unusual, and has a certain twist. It's like the Twilight Zone twist.
How did you find him? I know he's been on our program with us. He's been with me, but how did you find him?
Yes, well, I've known Lee Spiegel, the late Lee Spiegel.
Yeah, he was a dear friend. I miss him.
Yes, and we worked together on a project. And some time ago, I guess it was over a year ago, when I did the keynote at MUFON International Symposium in Denver, Lee had told me that his friend Mark Hartzman was going to be there, and he wanted us to meet because he thought he would be someone I'd like to interview. And, of course, sure enough, I was interested. And so we met there, and then we continued conversation throughout the time. And then his book came out just a few weeks ago. Actually, I think on the 17th, not a few weeks, a little over a week ago. And here we are.
We Are Not Alone, The Extraordinary History of UFOs and Aliens Invading Our Hopes, Fears, and Fantasies. It's a great title, isn't it?
Well, it sure is, but his book covers a whole lot of things, a lot of paranormal things. But in my part 2 with Mark, the weird historian, he certainly continues that Twilight Zone type story that is so strange and bizarre, and that he found when he was working with David Marler, and he spent some time going through all of David Marler's history books, clippings, and documents, and all kinds of memorabilia that David had accumulated. There's so many oddities, and in this part 2, he'll talk about an oddity about Mars. He'll talk about hypnotic regressions and hybrid children, and also a strange abduction by fairies from the 1600s. That you might say these are far out stories from the ancient past to modern day, and they certainly are. It goes all the way from the famous to the obscure. So in this part 2, we'll have another strange but true story that you may not have heard that involves a past presidential candidate and how this man claimed that an extraterrestrial influenced his political decision. Here now is my part 2 conversation with the weird historian, Mark Hartzman.
You have so many astounding stories in your book, including contactees and abductions. And one was Gabriel Green, who ran for president in 1960 because he said spacemen told him to. Tell us about that.
So the contactees, just for some quick background, this was really something was going on in the 50s and in the early 60s. This group of people who believed that they were contacted by extraterrestrials who landed. Usually they were Venusians who looked just like human beings, but maybe dressed differently, and like nice blonde hair was a frequent description. And so they had a lot of different thoughts. And oftentimes it was these messages about the dangers of the atomic age, and we're getting too close to damaging the Earth and the solar system or the universe. So almost like they were warning us to stop this. So one of these contactees was a guy named Gabriel Green. And he claimed that the spacemen, as he termed them, told him to run for president in 1960. So he actually got himself on a ticket, at least for a little while. He eventually dropped out. But he was running against John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon in 1960. And I have in the book this wonderful ad that was running in the newspaper, America needs a space-age president.
He was definitely before his time. He'd certainly fit right in here now in our upcoming election. And the abduction stories that you cover in your book, particularly one that has impacted pop culture from Kim Carlsberg from Baywatch. Tell us about that.
I met Kim Carlsberg last year. I was at the MUFON International UFO Symposium in Denver, and she was selling a book called The Art of Close Encounters that she had put together, which is a beautiful hardcover book that shows lots of artwork from different people who have either experienced UFOs or aliens or just been inspired. So I told her about the book I was writing, We Are Not Alone, and I asked her if I could talk to her if she had experiences, and she proceeded to tell me about a lot of really amazing experiences. And so you mentioned Baywatch. So she was the camera woman for Baywatch, which I thought was pretty interesting. You know, Pamela Anderson and David Hasselhoff. Pretty popular show in I guess that was late 80s, early 90s. So she had claimed to have been abducted many times over the years, and that she had hybrid children from these encounters. And so she discussed meeting one of the hybrids who visited her home and finding, that to be an extraordinary experience, that he came to her home and she tried to get her camera. She's a camera woman. You'd think she'd have photos, but she said her equipment was locked up and she couldn't get to it in time before he was going to leave. So she didn't have any photos, but still an amazing story. And what I love about this is not just this abduction story and that she believes that she has these hybrid children, which is really remarkable, but I love the fact that this is one abduction story that, whatever you choose to believe, it's impacted pop culture because, as she told me, everyone on the Baywatch set knew about her experiences.
The abduction of Anne Jeffries by fairies is another amazing story. It's really hard to make this stuff up.
This one I thought was particularly interesting. This was in 1645, an abduction story. And it's one of these cases where this person, her name was Anne Jeffries, as you mentioned. So she claimed that she was in her garden. This was in Cornwall, England, by the way. And she was basically plucked from her garden by beings that she called fairies. And she said that she was just out there in the garden knitting some stockings. And all of a sudden, she said 6 small people, all in green clothes, so little green men or women, had scared her and then basically swept her up into the air and took her off to, quote, some distant place flying through the air. She said she was whirled through space and then found herself back in the garden surrounded by a crowd who was witnessing her basically suffering from convulsions. And she said that the fairies continued to visit her over the next year, but no one ever saw them who was with her. So it's a curious story. So you wonder, okay, did she have some sort of alien abduction experience back in the 17th century? Or this kind of gets into a little bit of a theory that Jacques Vallée has proposed, the idea that there's a commonality between different kinds of beings from folklore. And could these all be existing in some alternate dimension or parallel dimension to us? So it's another interesting thought. But I thought finding a story like that from 1645 was quite fascinating.
Now, you also have a strange story in your book about David Huggins and the hybrid aspect.
Yeah, so David Huggins is an artist who claimed to have had experiences from when he was a child growing up in rural Georgia. And then when he was about 17, he claimed to have had a very, very close relationship with a female extraterrestrial who called herself, or he called her Crescent. I think he was in Georgia when he was growing up. Moved up to New York, still had these encounters over the years, but it wasn't something he really thought much about, or the memories maybe got kind of buried until he saw Bud Hopkins' book, Intruders. And he read about these other cases of people having these encounters, and they all started coming back into his head. Like all these memories started filling his head again. And so he started painting all these experiences that he remembered. And I have a couple of the paintings reproduced in the book. They're beautiful, and they depict what he remembered. And, you know, whether these things happened or not, as he tells the stories, he's confident that these are the things that happened to him. He has no doubt in his mind. And he has hybrid children, he said, from these close relationships.
Barbara Lamb is an amazing hypnotherapist and says she has been a hypnotherapist to thousands of people. What attracted you to that story to put in your book?
Well, I was really interested in this idea of hypnotic regression and what people were experiencing through that and the stories that they were remembering through that process. And I wanted to talk to different therapists who practice that to see what their thoughts were on it and how accurate that might be. So Barbara Lamb was one of the ones I was able to speak to. And I don't think I knew she'd worked with thousands of patients until I spoke with her. I just knew that she had worked with patients. And so I was actually amazed that she'd worked with that many. And she described how people have just had these different sorts of marks that they might wake up with that weren't there the night before. Maybe it's an indentation or a scar in a place that they couldn't have even reached if they wanted to. And they come to her and they'd have these hypnotic regression sessions. And they would have these memories of some kind of alien encounter. In some cases, she said that there might be I think she mentioned one, there was like a BB-sized implant in someone's arm and they couldn't explain how it got there. But she also talked about how in some cases, because that seems to be, I think, the typical things, I was poked and prodded and probed and all these, awful things. But she also talked about how some people had very pleasant memories that they thought they were being guided in some way to do good or had a better understanding of things or had hybrid children that they were proud of, not unlike what we talked about with Kim Carlsberg.
Is there one piece of what you think may be the best example of potential scientific evidence that you've come across?
I think there's a couple things that have been interesting. When I explored the scientific efforts to find signs of extraterrestrial intelligence, one of them that pops up is called the WOW signal from 1977, where this was from the Big Ear radio tower at Ohio State University. And it would basically print out its readings every day, every night, and scientists would kind of go through and analyze these to see if there's anything unusual or interesting in it. And one night, this happened overnight for, I believe it was about 72 seconds, this reading came in, and a scientist named Dr. Jerry Eman was going through it the next day when he had the stack of papers delivered to him, and he sees the signal that came through. Basically, it's like a series of numbers. Usually it's ones, twos, and threes, which is like background noise. This was 6 and above in letters, and basically anything 5 and above was unusual. Once you got past 9, you went to letters. So having a 6 and going up in digits and going into the alphabet signified something very unusual. And so we thought this might be it. This seems like we've been contacted or there's something out there. So he believed it may have been extraterrestrial, but he also said he didn't have enough data to conclude that. But it's interesting. Maybe there's something there.
There were some early strange beliefs about extraterrestrial life, particularly on Mars, that you write about in the Science chapter 2.
This is, in fact, what got me going on my Mars book, the Big Book of Mars, was these different beliefs. I really got pulled into this subject by a Martian woman whose name was Umaruru, who was contacting a man in London telepathically in 1926. And I saw that headline. I was looking for a story for Weird Historian, actually, about Nikola Tesla, who was also trying to contact Mars. But then as I researched that, I came across all the different stories that were happening around it. So you had a lot of really brilliant people who believed that intelligent life might exist there. In 1877, for example, Giovanni Schiaparelli, who was an Italian astronomer, had spotted through his telescope this network of crisscrossing lines, and he called them canali, which translates to channels, which could be made naturally. But it got mistranslated to canals. And when people thought it was canals, that would mean it was artificially created. And so people started thinking, well, they must be amazing engineers to have created canals all across the planet. And the guy who was the most vocal about that was named Percival Lowell, who opened the Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona in 1894. And he was drawing maps of what he saw and describing the scenario of a dying planet where ice from the polar caps was being melted and distributed, an irrigation system through these canals to distribute it to everyone on Mars. So you started having people imagining what life might be like.
Is there one most bizarre, most mind-blowing historical UFO or alien item or story in your book? Or are there too many to choose from?
I'll go back not too far back in history, so it's within the realm of people having very clear memories still, is the Phoenix Lights in 1997, which is such an unusual story because this was thousands of people that witnessed this in Phoenix, this giant triangular spacecraft or object going above them, again, quietly. The Air Force tried to explain the way that they had some testing going on with some of its aircraft and dropping flares. That's what people were seeing were these flares. But then people described the motion they were seeing, which just does not seem to coincide with the motion of a flare being dropped. So it leaves you wondering, okay, well, what were these people seeing and how were thousands of people seeing it? And this included the governor of Arizona, who initially kind of made a mockery of it at a press conference, but later became quite vocal about the fact that he had gone out and he had seen it and he didn't know what he saw. What was going on in Phoenix in 1997? What did people see? And we still don't know.
And Dr. Lynn Katai personally photographed and videotaped this event as well. And she, of course, is a friend of Coast and has been on our show.
Yes, I spoke with her. I have a few great quotes from her in the book. But yeah, it's a fascinating case.
What do you hope your readers take away from your book as a main takeaway? There's so many.
I just hope that people kind of walk away with an open mind, and that they have more curiosity, they have more information than they did before they read the book. It's the kind of book you can kind of flip to any page and find something fascinating.
What's coming up next for the Weird Historian?
I'm working with a sword swallower I know to create a history of sword swallowing, which has been a lot of fun. And hopefully I'm going to hear soon about my next book with Quirk Books, which will be about some other very weird history.
Where can people keep up with your work, Mark, contact you, and find your book?
So you'll be able to find the book anywhere you buy books online, bookstores, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, bookshop.org. Any place you buy books, you'll be able to find it. You can find me at markhartzmanbooks.com. That's Mark with a C, MarkHartzman books.com. You can also find me at weirdhistorian.com. On Instagram, you can find me at either at Mark Hartzman or at Weird Historian. And on Twitter, also, I'm at Mark Hartzman. I'm pretty easy to find.
Thank you so much for joining us here tonight on Coast and bringing us all up to date on some of the more surprising and mind-boggling things you've dug up on UFOs and alien lore and history over the decades.
Well, thanks so much, Cheryl. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
What a great guest, Cheryl.
Oh, he was terrific, and I'm not too sure I want to dive into the sword swallowing story.
Yeah.
The EBGBs, but his stories are so fascinating, and he writes in such an entertaining way while he does something very important, in my view, and that's preserving history. People can judge for themselves what they want to believe, but one thing about Mark's book that it does, entitled We're Not Alone, he shows plenty of graphics, old clippings, photos, and all those support his stories, and it shows the difference in reporting of sightings of UFOs and extraterrestrial or alien stories over the years. It's how much it's changed dramatically from the ancient past to our current times. And I think it's really important that historical information is preserved as much as possible today. All of the history, whether it's fact, fiction, or lore, it still reflects the culture, because in today's news world, as you know, so much of history is ignored or forgotten, possibly purposefully at times. But as time marches on, we lose so many very important people and records about events, about the total history of UFOs and aliens and other related worldly events.
Mark's website is called weirdhistorian.com. His new book out is called We Are Not Alone, The Extraordinary History of UFOs and Aliens Invading Our Hopes, Fears, and Fantasies. Up next, we'll open up the phone lines, open lines with Cheryl Jones right here on Coast to Coast AM.